Good evening, brethren and sisters. You know, when the stock markets closed for New Year a few weeks ago, oil prices were low, which of course leads to increasing growth, doesn't it? And the stocks were correspondingly buoyant and looking forward to a continuing bull market in the new year. Today, oil prices are even lower. And yet the bears are chasing the bulls away. And now it seems that whenever the price of oil goes down, the stocks go down, and vice versa. Now, what's that to do with our subject? It just shows how that even the most obvious things, the most widely accepted things, that oil price being cheap is good, can soon change, can't it? And it's impossible for humans to predict the future. It's very difficult for humans to predict the future, isn't it? And just something as simple and as generalised as, will it be a good summer this year? You know, can make fools of anyone brave enough to make some prediction on that subject. And yet when we come to the Bible, we have such a contrast. Yes, some Bible prophecies are complicated and you might think, well, it could mean this and it could mean that. But many Bible prophecies are not like that. Some are very simple to understand, very precise, and appear, when you read them and you put yourself in the time when it was written down, appear to be extremely unlikely. And all the pundits of this world, they always predict the things that seem likely, don't they? And even then they can't get it right. The Bible predicts things that often seem ridiculously unlikely. I mean, how did Brother Thomas know that there would be a partial and primary restoration of the Jews before the coming of Christ? How did he know that, brethren and sisters? How did he know that this pre-adventual colonization of Palestine will be on purely political principles, and that they would return as agriculturalists and traders in the hope of ultimately establishing their commonwealth, but more immediately of getting rich in silver and gold by commerce? How did he know that, brethren and sisters? That it would occur under the efficient protection of the British power. And you know, if we spend some of our time thinking about biblical prophecies, it helps us, it enables us to see God's hand at work in the nations today. And that adds to our faith, brethren and sisters. If you can see God's hand at work, you believe that the things that he said will come, that they will indeed come. It adds to our faith and our hope. And because of that, it changes our lives. And that's why we read. If you turn with me to Hebrews chapter 11, we've just read the chapter. Come with me to verse 1 of Hebrews 11. We all know it very well, don't we? Hebrews 11 verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. What's that mean, brethren and sisters? You know, we can all hope for things. Doesn't mean that because we hope for something, it's going to happen, does it? You know, when Great Uncle Albert, who you hardly know, and who lives in a rundown council flat, tells you he's going to give you £100,000 in his will, you probably think, I bet that he says that to all his relatives, doesn't he? He just wants me to run round him in his old age. That's why he's told me I'm going to get a lot in his will. But when his executor rings up and tells you that you're one of the main beneficiaries, and perhaps you'd call round for a chat your attitude might change a little, mightn't it? You still don't know what's going to happen. You still don't know what you're going to get. But now your hopes have substance. There's a reason for believing them. And what gives substance to our hope, brethren and sisters? Where are we going to find evidence for things that we cannot see? The answer is, of course, by faith. Not the blind, meaningless faith of the churches where you believe because you want to believe, but a faith based on experience, where you've seen for yourself the accuracy of Bible prophecy and that the scripture cannot be broken for yourself. And the importance of prophecy is not that so that you can say, oh yes, I understand Revelation 12. Oh yes, I knew that was going to happen. That's not what it's for, is it, brethren and sisters? That's not the main point of why we have prophecy. It's so that we can have confidence that our hope is real, is substantial. And brethren and sisters, that kind of faith changes our lives. And we read in verse 2 of Hebrews 11, for by it the elders obtained a good report. And as we read through the chapter, brethren and sisters, we will see how that is so. By it, the elders obtained a good report, by faith. As the Spirit through James says, a man can say, thou hast faith and I have works. Okay, says James, show me thy faith without thy works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Because faith, if it has not works, is dead, being alone. You know, if faith doesn't change the way we behave, it's not real faith. It's just a fake. It's not real faith. Because if we really have faith, if we really believe, if we can really see that God is operating in the world and Christ is going to come, it will change the way we behave. That's real faith, isn't it? And this relationship between prophecy and faith is a two-way street. Prophecy that we see fulfilled strengthens our faith. Faith that we have makes us believe the prophecies that we haven't yet seen fulfilled, that they will indeed be fulfilled, that Christ will indeed come. Come with me, would you, down to verse 22 of Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11, verse 22. By faith Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. Now, what a wonderful man Joseph was, brethren and sisters. What great faith he had. And when we think of Joseph, what particular examples of his faith come to our minds? Perhaps how when he was sold into slavery by his own brothers, and God allowed this to come upon him, he was still so tied to the promises that he was able to resist the advances of Potiphar's wife. You know, when things go wrong, we can perhaps give up looking to that and think, oh, well, perhaps in the circumstances I'll look to this. He held on, didn't he? And he resisted the advances of Potiphar's wife. You know, and how, when he's thrown into jail, yet he still trusts in God, doesn't he? It doesn't break him. He still holds on to his faith. How much he'd suffered from his brethren. didn't stop him having faith. It didn't stop him seeing that he should do everything he could to save them. What a wonderful man Joseph was. What wonderful faith he had. And yet none of those is the example God chose in Hebrews 11 verse 22. It is that by faith Joseph, when he died, gave commandments concerning his bones. I doubt any of us would have chosen that example, would we, brethren and sisters? By faith, he gave commandment concerning his bones. But you see, brethren and sisters, this verse shows Joseph's belief in prophecy. Keep a finger here in Hebrews 11. We will definitely be back. But come with me now to Genesis chapter 15. You'll have to excuse me blowing my own trumpet. You know, it's what viruses do to you. Right, Genesis 15. And we'll go in at verse 13, where we read, and God says to Abraham, "Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them. And they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace," talking of course to Abraham. "Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And though Jacob and his family have gone down into Egypt, they've settled into a comfortable life, a privileged life in the land of Goshen. Yet Joseph knows from this prophecy," and that's what it is, brethren and sisters, he knows from this prophecy that in the 4th generation the children of Israel will leave Egypt. And so we read in Genesis 50 verse 24, "And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you, and bring you out of this land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence." You know, when Jacob lay a-dying, and I'm certainly not casting any aspersions on Jacob, but when Jacob lay a-dying, he charged them, "Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field at Ephron the Hittite." And on his death, all his family journeyed all the way to Hebron from Egypt to bury him. But Joseph doesn't say that. Joseph says, "You don't need to make a special trip for me, because I know that God will bring you out of this land. And he's going to take you to the promised land, to the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you can take my bones then. You don't need to make a special trip." By faith, Joseph, when he lay a-dying, gave commandment concerning his bones. And Joseph's tomb that was in Egypt was a witness every day to the children of Israel of his faith. It was a witness that one day they were going to be taken from Egypt and go to the promised land. And when Moses took his bones with them, as recorded in Exodus 13:19, and his bones were carried with them in all their wanderings in the wilderness, and they were finally reburied in Shechem, as we read in Joshua 24 verse 32, Joseph's faith was an example to the children of Israel that God's promise made 400 years earlier to Abraham was reliable and that it would be fulfilled. Come back to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11, and we'll go down now to verse 24. We read, "By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible." Just incidentally, as a quick aside there, putting the passages together, I believe that the forsaking of Egypt, not fearing the king, is not talking about when Moses left Egypt and ran away and went to Midian, where he met his future wife. It's talking about when he left that privileged life in the royal house as a prince to go and live with the children of Israel as slaves in the land of Goshen. He chose rather to suffer the affliction with the people of God. We might imagine that he just went there and he just lived there. It doesn't say that, does it? Choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God. We know what affliction they suffered. And the real reason I've come to this verse is that he esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. So, what did Moses know about Christ? What did he know about Christ? Well, let's go back to Genesis, shall we? Genesis 3:15. Words we all know well. Genesis 3:15. Talking to the serpent, of course, "I will put enmity between thee," the serpent, "and the woman, and between thy seed," sin, "and her seed. It," and it should be the word he, "shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." You know, Moses thought about the prophecies, thought about the promises. And when he thought about this promise, he saw the affliction of Christ. He saw that Christ would be reproached. He saw that he would be bruised in the heel. But in so doing, that he would crush sin. And if you come to chapter 22 of Genesis, and verse 17. God promises to Abraham that, verse 17, "In blessing I will bless thee, in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies." Notice that it is his enemies. The seed's enemies is his enemies. It's not their enemies. It's his enemies. And so even though the word seed, which is zerah in Hebrew, like coincidentally, or perhaps it's not coincidentally, I don't know, but as in English, the word seed doesn't typically give us the ability to understand if, there's a seed, or, here's a bag of seed, does it? We don't get from the word seed whether it's one individual seed or a whole sackful. Well, that's true in Hebrew, as it would be, as God designed it. Too. But because it says his seed, the seeds, because he said his enemies, the seed's enemies, but it's his, not their enemies, that tells us that the seed is singular. It's not there in the word itself for seed, but it is there in the word his. And that's definitely there in Hebrew. And that seed is singular, and it's Christ. That's who we're talking about in this verse. And so, rereading that verse, and if you'd forgive me putting in that substitution, Abraham was actually being told that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply that special singular seed, as the stars of heaven, as the sand which is on the seashore. And that special singular seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. Of course, we didn't have to figure that out for ourselves, did we? Because the Spirit, through the Apostle Paul, tells us in Galatians 3:16, now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not unto seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which, Paul tells us, is Christ. But you can figure that out from the Hebrew, from the Old Testament too. You don't have to rely on Galatians. And we also didn't have to figure out that that seed would be multiplied up, so that, as Hebrews 3 verse 8 says, and the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, in thee shall all nations be blessed. So then they which be of faith are blessed with faithful Abraham. And that multiplication of that individual singular seed, it includes all the men who are here in Hebrews 11. It's not just Gentiles who are chronologically after the time of Christ. It's for all nations. And it includes, of course, Abraham, David, Samuel, Isaiah. We could think of a myriad other faithful men. 7,000 that didn't bow the knee to Baal in the time of Elijah. It includes all those people of faith. There's only one gospel. It was the gospel preached to Abraham. It was the gospel preached to Adam. By faith, ye are saved. Only one gospel. The law of Moses was introduced for other reasons, and it had its purpose. But the means of salvation has never changed. The gospel has never changed. It's always been that by faith salvation comes. The law of Moses. And anybody who thought the law of Moses could save them was just getting the wrong end of the stick. And so, even though Moses didn't have the epistle to the Galatians to explain it to him, he only had the prophecies of Abraham. He understood, and he esteemed the reproach of Christ, as we read in Hebrews 11, greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. That simply means he looked forward to his reward. By faith he forsook Egypt. Who of us would give up that luxury and go and live with the slaves and have to work as a slave? By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, and no doubt the king was very angry at his unthankfulness, we can imagine. For he endured as seeing him who is invisible. And what Moses wanted was to inherit the things promised to Abraham. And his faith was the substance of things hoped for, the reward that he looked forward to. His faith was the evidence of the things which he couldn't see, so that he could see the things that were invisible. And we have to realise, brethren and sisters, we glibly read through the promises to Abraham because it's so long ago. To them, that was prophecy. If we were in those days and we looked at the promises to Abraham, we'd be going, now, I wonder what that means. I wonder how that's going to be fulfilled. And that's what Moses did. They had to think about them. They had to meditate on their meaning. They had to visualize how God was going to bring it about. And with that vision of hope before their eyes, it changed their lives. You made Moses give up all the riches, all the luxuries, and go and live as a slave. The Proverbs say, where there is no vision, the people perish. And you know, brethren and sisters, if we have no vision, if we have no picture in our mind of the kingdom that lives with us day by day, if our hope has no substance, then our treasures will be on earth. And where our treasure is, there will our heart be also. Okay, we've missed out Abraham, haven't we? Abraham himself, who probably takes the largest part in Hebrews 11. Just let's go to the last part of what it says about Abraham. Hebrews 11 verse 17. We read, by faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. Now, brethren and sisters, let's think of the person who is most precious to us, who's our love, our joy, our hope. And you have to take them, and you have to slit their throat, and then you have to cut them into the individual joints like a butcher does with a side of beef. And you have to lay the pieces on the altar in order that it can be an ascending offering, a burnt offering to God. Imagine that, brethren and sisters. Can you even imagine it? Can you imagine doing it? You know, Abraham had once hoped that Ishmael would be the seed. But God had said to him, send Hagar and Ishmael away. And they've gone. All Abraham's eggs, as it were, are now in one basket. Isaac is the only son. And yet he's being asked to offer him up as an ascending, a burnt offering. And he's willing to do it. He's willing to do it, brethren and sisters. Because he believed in prophecy. And he'd thought about, he'd meditated upon what it meant. He's seen the prophecy fulfilled before. He saw how the ancient Sarah had conceived as prophesied. How Isaac had been born as prophesied. And God's told him in Genesis 21 verse 12, in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And Abraham believes, brethren and sisters, doesn't he? It's going to be through Isaac that this promised seed is going to come. And so if Isaac is slain, not having had any children, God is going to provide a means whereby that can still come about. And the only way that Abraham can see that that's possible is by God raising him from the dead. And he believed, accounted that God was able to raise him from the dead. And Abraham had seen those promises fulfilled in his day and age, even though it was perhaps 40 years before. And we tend to think when we look at, it was in Abraham's life, he's seen that. And then this time, yes, he's now got to show faith. It's 40 years between. What happens to our faith in 40 years, brethren and sisters? A lot of you are too young for that, but what happens to our faith in 40 years? What happens to our excitement when we see 1967? Actually, I'm a little bit young for that. But when you see 1967, what happened then and the excitement and the faith that was there, what happens to it by the time you come to our day? Abram's only a man. It's 40 years before when he saw those other promises be fulfilled. Time goes past and you think, well, perhaps it was just one of those funny things. Perhaps I fooled myself, But Abraham was still able to demonstrate faith and believe that God would raise him even from the dead. And you might think it was, say, harder for Moses. He had to believe a 400-year-old prophecy. And likewise for Joseph, it was older for him than for Abraham. And we too have seen prophecy fulfilling. You know that, brethren and sisters. Check it out. There is only one language, as far as anybody knows, and go on Wikipedia or some encyclopedia or wherever you want to research it. There's only one language, as far as anybody knows, that has been resurrected from the dead. There's no other nation that has been scattered as completely as the children of Israel were scattered and have been restored. There's no other land, a land once flowing with milk and honey, that became arid and empty for hundreds of years, and then within a short period of time it's become fruitful again. There's no other land that was once so densely populated, and for the ancient world, Judea in the time of the Romans was a densely populated place. It was a fruitful land. A lot of people could be supported by it. No other land has been so densely populated, supporting millions of peoples. In the ancient world, that's a big number. And then became almost empty for many, many centuries. And then has so quickly been repopulated again, as God said it would be. And its people returned unwillingly. God had to use the fishers to fish them. He had to use the hunters to hunt them, as we read in Jeremiah 16, to force them to go back to their land. And no other modern nation, from the day of its birth, initially possessing no army, very little in the way of armaments. They were held illegally. We're talking about things that would be hidden. They had got no open arms industry. They'd got no open opportunity to buy arms and to keep them to defend themselves. They had to possess them illegally in the time of the British. But from the day of Israel's birth, a disparate group of underarmed militias, farmers mostly, were able to withstand the armed might of 6 well-established nations. And we're not talking about guerrilla or what in the modern world is called asymmetric warfare here either. You know, where the fighters of the less powerful belligerent hide amongst the civilians. And the more powerful one can't find out who are the soldiers here, who are the militia here, who's fighting against me. They can hide amongst the population. Because when Israel fought against 6 nations in 1948, if the Arabs won, they slaughtered everybody. They didn't have to say, oh, he's a soldier, oh, those are civilians, we'll let them go. They just killed the lot. No other people has been so hated, so despised, so oppressed, and has yet survived dispersion. And while Theodor Herzl, in his book The Jewish State, argued that the Jews will always be hated as long as they don't have their own land. That's what Herzl said in his book. But God said, oh no, they will always be hated. Even when they've got their own land, even when they're a country like everybody else, they'll still be hated. And they still are. And it is that hatred that will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. And of course, there's dozens and dozens of prophecies that we could turn to concerning the restoration of the people of Israel. And we could turn to prophecies on other subjects, such as Christ's first coming, say Isaiah 53 we can think of, Psalm 22, Micah 5, Zechariah 9. We can think of those 4 great nations, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. We can think of the development of the apostasy in the 1st century, the development of the papacy in the Christian, Roman and Holy Roman empires. And even coming into our days, we've seen prophecies of Britain and its part in the restoration of the Jews. The rise of the EU, the beast, I believe. Russia's role as the dragon and as Gog. And, of course, more importantly than any of those, of Christ's coming and of the establishment of God's kingdom and of the building of the new temple in Jerusalem. Some of those have been fulfilled, obviously. Some we are still waiting to be fulfilled. But we have seen prophecy fulfilled in our day. Where is our faith, brethren and sisters? Where is our faith? Moses and Joseph and Abraham had a clear vision because of the prophecies that they had. They meditated, they pondered, they looked for the fulfillment. And so they were able to overcome the trials that came upon them. And they were great trials, weren't they, brethren and sisters? They were great trials. Their hope had substance, brethren and sisters. They had evidence which enabled them to see him who is invisible. And that substance, that evidence, was their faith. And by it they obtained a good report. And so what of us? Do we meditate on the simple and clear prophecies and perhaps search out the details of how these things were fulfilled so that it can build up our faith? Do we? Maybe when it comes to the more difficult prophecies, letting God teach us rather than jumping in at the deep end. And you know, brethren and sisters, when we come to the judgment seat, I don't believe that it'll be a requirement that you understand Revelation 12 or that you know what Ezekiel's temple is going to look like, if I can call it Ezekiel's temple. I don't think those will be qualifications necessary for salvation. However, it depends on why we don't know. If we don't know, if we don't understand, because we couldn't be bothered, because we had our own private interpretation and were too proud to humble ourselves and listen to God's word, or because we just thought that we knew better than God, and we knew what was necessary for our spiritual diet, better than God, who's given us a complete spiritual diet here. All scriptures are given for, you know what I mean. And brethren and sisters, we can rely on the accuracy of Bible prophecy, for the scripture cannot be broken. Prophecy is not just for academics. Prophecy is for our faith. Let us ponder and meditate upon it as part of a well-balanced, healthy spiritual diet that, God willing, will give substance to our hope and enable us to endure unto the end, so that in God's mercy we will see for ourselves the glory of its fulfilment.